This morning we're going to look at the resurrection of Jesus through the Gospel of Matthew. In particular, we will move through the last chapter, which is 28, to see Matthew's witness of the resurrection and the significance of the resurrection. So his witness of the resurrection comes from two sources. First, from verses 1 through 7, we see the words from the empty tomb. So I want to read that whole passage first. It says, "Now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow, and the guards shook with fear of him and became like dead men. And the angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus, who has been crucified. He is not here. He has been risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. Behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee, where you will see him. Behold, I have told you.'" So let's go back and look at those verses. The first verse is now after the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day of rest. That's Saturday. That's when Jewish people were told and commanded, instructed to worship at the end of the week because God rested at the end of creation. But here it's the day after the Sabbath. The Sabbath is over. It implies that a new work of God has begun, a new work of recreation, starting with Christ's resurrection and then with us, his people, being recreated into the image of Christ. It says, "And it began to dawn toward the first day of the week." Dawn, the word there is a participle. The dawn's light began to shine, and it continued to shine, showing again through nature what was occurring in the spiritual realm. That a new light, a new dawn, a new day, age was beginning. And it was the first day of the week. Once again, the first day of a new work week. All those three things point to and emphasize a new beginning. So in the resurrection, we see a new beginning. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came. Mary literally means bitter. And Magdalene means tower. Magdalene it comes from Magdala, which is a city that's right below Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. And Mary Magdalene is one in whom Jesus cast out 7 demons. There is a erroneous thought that she was a prostitute, which is there's no historical evidence of that whatsoever. It came about when people from the church took a passage in Luke that talked about a prostitute and then somehow linked Mary Magdalene with that woman. But there's nothing in Scripture that implies that she was sinful in that way, other than that she was a woman in whom 7 demons were cast out. Then it mentions the other Mary, and we know from the different parallel texts that this is James's mother, the Apostle James. And the other Gospels have more women with them. But Matthew's going to focus on these 2 women as he goes through this account for today. And it's probably because in Matthew's Gospel, in chapter 27, verse 56, it was these 2 Marys that were there witnessing the cross. And in 27:61, it was these 2 Marys who saw where the tomb was, where they lay the body. So here it just continues on. They witness the crucifixion, the burial, and now the resurrection. And remember, in the Old Testament, you need 2 witnesses to confirm something to be true, 2 to 3 witnesses. Now the interesting thing here is that they're women. In the first century, in Jewish culture and in Roman culture, women couldn't even appear as witnesses in court. Their witnesses were not seen as being valid. So here you can see where Jesus and the New Testament, the Gospels, are elevating the position of women again. The ones that society has put down, he has chosen them to be the witnesses, the first ones to see his resurrection. And it says that they came to look at the grave. The purpose was to see it in order to finish the burial customs. The rest of the other Gospels talk about them having certain oils to anoint the body, and that was part of their customs. But Why? Why would they do that? If you think about it, here's Jesus, whom they've dedicated their life for a few years to, and they've given everything to, and yet they believe he's dead. They're bringing oils to seal him up forevermore to be in the tomb. So what does that mean? That means that he lied to them. It means that he deceived them. And yet they're showing him this kindness and this honor in burial, and anointing him in burial, and putting these spices there that are very expensive. Why would that be the case? Why would they show him that kind of kindness and that kind of honor? Well, it was because they loved him. It was because they were shown that kind of honor and that kind of kindness. Even though they didn't understand what was going on, they still loved him. They still knew who he was. They knew that he was dead, but they also knew that something else would happen. But they didn't quite understand there. And in Greek, Matthew chose a certain word to make a play on words here, because that word could also mean to understand. So from a divine perspective, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to understand the grave. And in fact, that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to understand it. Now, at this point in your text, Matthew breaks the narrative sequence. He doesn't go on chronologically to the next event. But as he's having the women go to the tomb, he forgot he needs to explain what they're going to find at the tomb and how that got there. So he backs up for us and explains some of the events that led up to the scene in which they're going to find when they reach the tomb. The text says, "And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was white as snow, and the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men." Now, interesting, it says that the angel descended and rolled away the stone. Was that needed? Could God have just done it? Could Jesus have just done it? Why an angel? Why the big show? Well, it was because God was making a witness to humanity. He was giving testimony. He was giving a miracle. The angel is a messenger of God. And it was the angels who interpreted the birth of Christ. Here, it's the angels who are interpreting the resurrection of Christ. The only other spoken words of an angel in the gospel in this gospel is at the birth of Christ. So here he's descending from heaven, showing the authority of God, the power of God, and he rolled away the stone that was sealed with a Roman seal. The Roman seal showed authority of the greatest empire and force of the world. And it was just one angel from heaven to show the authority of heaven that removed that stone. Because heaven's authority is far, far greater. And he rolled away the stone not to let Jesus out, but to let other people in, to see, in fact, that he's not there. He's already risen. And the earthquake is associated with the rolling away of the stone. The stone rolling away is the main verb in this text, so it's the earthquake happened before the stone was rolled away. So it's associated with that. And that earthquake, at the same time as the stone being rolled away, that's telling us again through nature that Jesus had conquered the grave. He conquered the ground. When people spoke of the dead being in the ground, being in the grave or Sheol, that was literally underneath. So by the ground shaking, it was showing that something had disturbed it and something had overpowered it, which was Christ. So it didn't only demonstrate it to those guards that were there or the women who were on their way, but it was a demonstration to all of Jerusalem. All of Jerusalem felt that earthquake. And it was to show that Jesus was more powerful than the grave, more powerful than death. So then it says that the angel sat upon the stone. So he rolled it away and then sat upon it because his work was done. There was nothing else anyone was going to do. Those Roman guards weren't going to overpower him or do anything of the sort. His work was done. Now, as an interesting side note, all four of the Gospels record the empty tomb and the discovery of Jesus being alive and appearing to other people. But none of them record how he was resurrected, what happened. It only describes what happened afterwards, or the discovery of the empty tomb, or that he rose. But yet here we see the details of the angel, what he looked like, the clothing, how he came down, what he did. And this indicates to us that that scene was witnessed by the guards. And we have that information because the guards shared it. And we know from this gospel and the other gospels that there were more than 2 guards here, because there was at least 2 guards that went and spoke to the chief priest. There was other guards there as well. So it was at least 3 guards there. And it implies that at least one of them turned to Christ, because we have this story. Verse 3, we see a common description of an angel that's in full glory, the glory of God. And it shows here that here God is coming in strength and in power, and he's making a show. He's making this stand out as much as he can. Now remember, this is at dawn, so it's still very, very dark. So to have an angel's face look like lightning, it would be even more brilliant at this time of day, while it's still dark. So it clearly shows that there's no earthly meddling with the tomb. This removal of the stone and Jesus coming out, this is by the power and the will of heaven. And it says in verse 4 that the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. It's fascinating. The power of Rome, the strongest empire in the world, was no match for just one angel. The earthly might shook in fear of harm. And basically they passed out. They act like they were dead. They passed out. They couldn't handle it. And that was just one of the Lord's army, one of his hosts. It shows the immense power of heaven. It's interesting, one of the commentators, Donald Hagner, writes, "The irony is not to be missed. The ones assigned to guard the dead themselves appear dead, while the dead now have been made alive." In God's decision, in his will, the whole power structure of earth is flipped on its head. And God is shown to be victorious and powerful. So this scene happened shortly before the women arrived. And because when they came, they found the tomb open. They found the guards gone. And by that time, the angel had moved from sitting on the rock into the grave, into the tomb itself. And in verse 5 it continues and says, "The angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He is not there. He's not here, for he is risen, just as he said. Come, see the place where he was lying. Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you.'" Now it's interesting, just from a historical standpoint, Luke and John record 2 angels, where Matthew follows the dialogue of just one. It focuses on the one angel and leaves out the other detail just to keep the message in the story simple. And so does Mark. And according to the other Gospels, this angel is in the tomb. So when the women go in to look and to go into the tomb, they're startled because they see this angel who is also, it appears to them, bright and gleaming. And thus they say, "Don't fear. Don't be afraid." Usually, seeing an angel in glory is going to make you afraid because you don't know what in the world that is or what's going to happen. It's an incredible strength and holiness and power, and you don't know if it's friend or foe. And there's also a Jewish custom that when you see an angel, it means he's there to escort you over to heaven or through death. So a lot of times when they say "don't be afraid," it is saying, "I'm not here as an enemy, and I'm not here to take you on because you're about to die." So he says, "Don't fear." Now notice, the guards feared, But these women, when they are afraid, he says, don't be afraid. Now why? Do you notice when the guards see the angels, they pass out? Why don't the women pass out? It's because they've been given the grace of God to stand. They are here not as enemies. They are here because they love Jesus. They are honoring him. They're showing kindness. So they were shown great grace from God in order to stand and to speak with these angels. Because they were looking forward. They were seeking for Jesus, seeking to honor him out of love. And here the angel says he's not here. This is the place of the dead. This is the tomb. He's alive, so he's not here, for he is risen. The risen there is passive, and what's called a divine passive in Greek, meaning God is the one who raised him. He's been raised by the power of God. Notice the angel says that you are looking for Jesus, the one who has been crucified. The angel is confirming that yes, this Jesus actually died a horrible death, but he is risen now. That's done. So that an angel who is from heaven, it's a holy angel who cannot lie, confirms to us that Jesus had died, but now he's no longer dead. He's been risen. So it shows that the body hasn't been stolen, but this is a divine act. This is a miracle. And it's just as he has said, just as Jesus had prophesied. It adds to the confirmation that everything Jesus said is true. Everything that he says will happen. And the angels, it's funny because, holy angels, they can't lie. And this whole scene is an incredible experience. And you would think that the testimony of the angel was enough. But then he says, well, come on in and take a look. He also gives them physical evidence. Come look at the place where he was buried. And you would think, well, okay, it's going to be empty. Well, there could be a number of explanations of how that happened. But we know, and it's probably that in that early church, they all knew as well. But when he says, come and look at the place where he's laid, what are they seeing? They're not seeing just a plain stone. They're seeing the burial cloth. They're seeing the shroud and the headpiece, a headcloth that was rolled up. And when you're reading John's gospel, you read that it was the clothing was laid in such a way where it wasn't unwrapped. It wasn't undone. It was as if the body just went through it, showing that no one unwrapped him to steal the body. It was a miracle. He was gone. He was not there. So that's going to give them additional evidence. And in the Gospel of John, that is what makes John believe, seeing the burial cloth. So the angel here confirms two things for us. His message to them is twofold. One, that Christ is risen. And it was by the power of God. So the angel interprets that historical event for the women without a doubt. It wasn't stolen. Nothing else happened. He didn't somehow survive. You weren't seeing an hallucination. You didn't come to the wrong tomb. You came to the right one. He's risen. And then his second message, which is fascinating, is go to Galilee. Points the disciples to that meeting place. He's saying, go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead. And behold, he's going ahead of you into Galilee, where you will see him. It leaves us in suspense. It points to another event that's going to be important, where you'll see Jesus. And Jesus himself had told them in Matthew 28:32 that he'll see them again after he's been risen in Galilee. And then he ends it by saying, behold, I have told you. Meaning, I'm an angel. I'm from heaven. I can't lie. I said it. It's going to happen. There you have it. A message from heaven. So in there, that message from the angels, that's the words from the empty tomb, saying that he's risen. The words that came from that tomb itself, the tomb itself being empty, saying that Christ is gone, and then the angels' interpretation of that evidence, that he's risen. But Matthew also adds the words from the risen Christ, verses 8 through 10. It says, they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to report to the disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and greeted them. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me." So here it's fascinating in Matthew, there's a brief appearance of Jesus to the women. And Matthew's keeping this episode, this scene, extremely brief. It says that the women were going away from the tomb with fear. Now, what were they afraid of? Presumably, they were afraid of the authorities, the Jewish and the Roman authorities. They just came from a tomb where there was no body and a Roman seal was broken. They couldn't say, how would that hold up in court? Well, an angel did it. That probably wouldn't hold up very well in front of Romans. So they were afraid. And then the other Gospels tell us that they had feared and they didn't tell anyone else what had happened, but they went straight for the disciples. So they didn't know what would happen to them. And they don't really know what's going to happen next. What is Jesus going to do next? The angel said that he's risen, then what? They just didn't know, and that caused them fear. So they didn't tell anybody. They went straight to the disciples. But they didn't go along just with fear. They went with great joy. Why do they have joy? That joy tells us that they believe the testimony of the angels, of the angel in this gospel. And they're obeying his instruction. This is great news. And then Jesus appears to them. And what do? What are the two things? How do they respond to the resurrected Christ? Number one, they show affection. They grab onto his feet. They cling to him. And then number two, they worship him. They worship him as God. And notice, Jesus accepts their worship. He doesn't rebuke them or condemn them for it. What he says is, don't be afraid. Don't worry about what will happen next. Don't worry about the authorities. Just do what heaven has commanded, what I've commanded through my angel. And he repeats that instruction. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there. Now, interesting, the angel said disciples, which is a larger group than just the 11. Here, Jesus calls them my brethren, which is a warm relational term for his followers. Brethren means brothers and sisters. So it's not just the 11 disciples. And remember, most of them scattered. When Jesus was taken, when the shepherd was struck, the sheep scattered. But yet Jesus calls them my brothers, my brethren, my brothers and sisters. It's a relational. He's not scolding them. He's warmly receiving them. And here he's saying, have them leave for Galilee. So because it's my brothers and sisters, my brethren, this is probably in Galilee where they meet, is the occurrence where in 1 Corinthians 15:6 it says, he appeared to more than 500 at one time. This is probably that event when they get to Galilee. But Matthew's focus is on the 11, on the disciples. Now, another thing we need to realize is Jesus, on that very day after he appears to the women, he appears to two disciples, Cleopas and another unnamed disciple on the road to Emmaus. And then when they come back, they announce that he's appeared to Simon. Now, whether Simon was that second disciple or Simon received an additional appearance, it's hard to know. But then as those disciples are telling the apostles who were together, all 10 of them in a room, Jesus appears to them. And then 8 days later, Thomas is with them. And he appears to them as well. And then they go to the Sea of Galilee. And he appears to them on the beach. And they have breakfast together. But Matthew leaves all of that out. Why? Because all of those things would be a distraction from the message and the climactic point that Matthew is trying to bring about in the message of Jesus in Galilee. So he focuses in on what is important, which is the message that Jesus gives. But before he does, verses 11 through 15, Matthew records the cover-up. Because what happened with the guards? What is the official rumors? What's the deception? With every truth, Satan always gives a lie, a deception, something that you can believe in if you don't really want to. And this these verses communicate how the Jewish authorities created an explanation for the empty tomb, which was that the body was stolen. And thus they falsely accused the disciples. Now remember, that tomb was sealed. And in general, tomb robbing was illegal. But to break the seal, a Roman seal as well, would bring down the wrath of Rome. So they were really accusing and setting up the disciples to be persecuted. So Matthew records that just to clearly state how that's false and how that was a response created by those who were hostile to Jesus. So now in the Galilee meeting, Matthew records the significance of the resurrection in the words from the Mount, verse 16 through 20. Verse 16 to 20 says, "But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some were doubtful. And Jesus came up and spoke with them, saying, 'All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And lo, or behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age.'" So this is the end of Matthew's gospel. This is the climactic last words. This is the finish, the punchline of the entire gospel. It's where it's all been moving towards and pointing towards. And Matthew has elevated this, put a spotlight on this. So let's go over this. This is the significance of the resurrection. In verse 26 it says, "But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus designated." Now, this is the region of Galilee, and as you can see, there are a bunch of mountains. Where were they? No one knows. They did. They knew which one it was. How they designated it is not told. But there's somewhere there. And it's 11, Matthew is focusing on the 11 disciples that are there. Because those are the apostles, the foundation of the church that's going to go out. But there are other disciples there as well, with them. And Jesus instructed them to go there to Galilee. Instructed both the women and to tell the disciples. And beforehand, in Matthew 26, he told them to go there as well. So this shows that they obeyed his instructions. And they traveled 2 to 3 days from Jerusalem to this designation. And he appears to them in the meeting place was in a mountain, which suggests that it was a private meeting. It's away from the cities. And it echoes Moses, Mount Sinai, and God giving further revelation to his people. So here in verse 17 it says, "When they saw him, they worshipped him." They worshipped him. The first major significance of the resurrection is that Jesus is God. He is worthy of our worship. And again here, it's emphasized that Jesus receives their worship. He doesn't rebuke them. He receives it. And it's in great contrast to in chapter 4 when Satan is tempting him and Satan says, "Worship me and I'll give you all the kingdoms." And he says, "It's written, you should only worship the Lord your God." So here in Matthew, it's confirming that Jesus is the Lord their God. And it's fascinating that Matthew writes, "But some were doubtful." In the way the Greek has it, it suggests that this is a second group. There's another article, but some who were with them were doubtful. And the word there means hesitant or uncertain in worshiping a man. It's not that they're not believing in Jesus, but that they're hesitant about it. They're uncertain. That word is only used one other time in the Gospels, and it's used for Peter when he's walking on the water. And you remember the wind came and he doubted, right? And he started to sink. And he had to call out to Jesus to save him. And Jesus said, "Peter, why did you doubt?" It wasn't that that Peter didn't believe in Jesus, but that he was hesitant at that time about Jesus' power, how this was all going to work out. So the same thing is happening here. And Matthew is being extremely honest here. And showing an honest difficulty in changing their thinking in light of this new revelation. In Jewish thinking, the resurrection was going to happen at the end time and everyone will be resurrected all together. There was no concept or any idea of one man being resurrected. And it's a man. Can we worship him? They still had an uncertainty and a hesitancy about what this meant, his resurrection meant. Now, we know it's not talking about the 11 disciples, because in John's gospel, when Jesus came into the room 8 days later with Thomas there saying, if I don't see him and touch him, I won't believe, Jesus gave full evidence. And from there, they had no doubt that A, that was Jesus, and B, he was the object of worship, because that's where, in John's gospel, the climactic saying is Thomas saying, my Lord and my God. So here it's this people, some of the other ones that were with him. So even people who are seeing the risen Christ with their own eyes hesitated to know what that means and how that changed their lives and what that means for tomorrow. Some knew and they worshiped. But for those who hesitated, Matthew records the climactic words of the risen Christ. He didn't leave them in hesitation and in uncertainty. He fills it in for them. He communicates and teaches them. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. All authority has been given to me. That's another divine passive that's been given to him by God the Father. That makes him Lord of all. He is Lord over all creation. When we say heaven and earth, it means everything that it was ever created. He has an authoritative position, being free to speak and to act as he pleases. Now that includes the authority to give life, to bring death, to bring judgment, or to deliver in salvation. Jesus displayed his authority throughout the gospel, but here it's at a new level. It's all-encompassing, it's absolute, it's unlimited. And it's where Jesus is being reinstated back to his pre-existent glory and authority. He is not putting himself under subjection to the Father as he did as a slave in his earthly life. He's now in his preeminent glory as he had before he entered and took on flesh. So that is the second major significance of the resurrection, that Jesus is Lord over creation, over everything. And that position was given to him in the resurrection. So that truth, that forms the basis for what he then commands. Because he's Lord, he is the King of all creation, has authority, then he speaks forth commands. And there it says in verse 19, go, therefore, because I have all authority over all creation, and that means you and you and you and you, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. The main verb there is make disciples. That's the only command in that. The rest of them are describing or participles that are attached to it. They all do have an element of, in order to make disciples, you have to do these things. So they all have an implication of a command, but the command and the main thought is, because I am Lord of all, I need you to make disciples. I'm commanding you to make disciples. And what does it mean to be a disciple? The word is manthano. We get math or mathematics from it. It's speaking of following Jesus and learning from him. And basically, he's telling the disciples who have been following with Jesus for the last 3 years or so to make more people just like you. Just like you learned from me, you need to lead others to learn from me in the same way. Now, this command, notice, is not to evangelize, but to perform a broader and deeper task of discipling the nations. Many denominations and missionary groups misunderstand this and spend all their efforts winning new converts rather than anchoring them in the Christian faith. Now, surely when it's talking about going out and making disciples, that's going to imply that they have to be converted to follow Jesus. But that's the beginning. He's saying you need to spend time with them, teach them, have life with them, be an example with them. That is Jesus' Great Commission, not just to make converts. And in fact, it's been shown in many studies that just simply making converts and moving on, most of those conversions are fake or false. They don't really understand what they did, and there's no root in them. So Jesus mandates that all mission activity emulate the pattern of discipling followers just like he did, as it is exemplified in the gospel. So just as we learn throughout the Gospel of Matthew, that should be happening over and over again, which means that we're to teach people and to live by example and share life with them. And he says to go to all nations. Because he has universal authority, all authority, there's a universal mission to all nations, building a worldwide kingdom. And that includes us. Because of the resurrection, we are now given the opportunity to become part of his kingdom throughout the world. The other two participles, the other two ideas explain how do we make a disciple. The first thing he says is by baptizing them. Baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, baptizing, that was an act of conversion. In the cultural idea, in the first century culture, it was a sign of one's initiation into a faith or into religion. Christianity was not the only religion that baptized. And in fact, many other religions did certain other ceremonies that show that you were entering into this kind of faith, this kind of religion. So here, it would be viewed as a physical act that was an initiation rite. But it was so much more than that. Baptism is a metaphorical picture that includes two ideas. One is cleansing. When pagans or non-Jewish people were converted over into Judaism, they were baptized. And it was a symbol of them being cleansed of their sins. And then John the Baptist as well, when he baptized, it was a symbol of the cleansing of their sins. So here as well, when Jesus is talking about baptizing them, it's a physical act that represents a spiritual reality of being cleansed. But secondly, baptism has a metaphorical picture of being immersed into something, to be united with it. And we are familiar with being united or immersed into water. You are completely surrounded and engulfed in it. And here it's being baptized into the triune God. In the name, which is singular, of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The three persons, but the one God. So when we're baptized into the name, we're baptized or being immersed or identifying with everything that God is, God has, and God represents. And it is a relationship with and a commitment to the triune God as your God. The Father planned salvation. The Son accomplished salvation. And the Holy Spirit applies salvation. So when we are united with the Father, we are united with him into his family as sons and daughters. And we have a relationship with the God of the universe. When we are united with the Son, and what he is and what he represents is his death and resurrection, the death that paid for sin, and his resurrection that is new life and righteousness and justification. It's where we live out righteousness. And as we're united with the Spirit indwells us, applies the work of Christ to us. It transforms our life and sustains our life, our spiritual life. That's being baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit into the triune work of salvation of the triune God. The second reason or second way we make disciples is it is described as being learners, because they are teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. So another aspect of being a disciple is being taught. Teaching it is learning and being instructed and teaching, being taught all that Jesus commanded and instructed. Now, this would include the Old Testament law, its proper interpretation, and further revelation that Jesus gave, both in words and the example of his life. All of these things, which are throughout the Gospel of Matthew, are to be continued and passed on and taught. It shows the importance of teaching, not just by word, but by life as well. And the disciples are those who were not just taught these things, but they're obeying these things as followers of Christ. And that is crucial to being part of his kingdom. This verse clearly teaches that Jesus' life and instructions recorded in this gospel applies to his new church. And we know from the gospel that his word endures forever. And therefore his people must be centered around that word that never changes. So the third significance of the resurrection is that authoritative Christ is now creating a new worldwide kingdom through the work of the triune God, who are obedient to his authority and to his lordship. And this is what was prophesied in Daniel 7. In Daniel 7:13 and 14, it says, "And I kept looking," Daniel speaking, "in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like the Son of Man was coming." A phrase that Jesus spoke of and identified as himself, even to the chief priests, saying that he is the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him, the Son of Man, was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples and nations and men of every language might serve him. That is the new kingdom. That is the authority that was given to him, to make disciples and people that are in his kingdom and obeying him. His dominion is everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Parallels perfectly, because the resurrection and what Matthew is recording here is the fulfillment of this passage. Christ has established his kingdom. Acts 2 is another great example. Peter's first sermon also proclaims that Christ has been seated. God has made him both Christ and Lord, and is seating on the David's throne in heaven now. The final words of the risen Christ that Matthew emphasizes are, "And lo," or "Behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." The fourth and final significance of the resurrection that Matthew gives us is that Jesus is forever with his people. Matthew's gospel began with the birth of Jesus, where he was associated with Isaiah's prophecy, where a virgin would conceive and bear a son, and you'll call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And here he ends with it, that God is with us. Jesus is with us always. And he's not with us just merely in terms of his presence, but with his graciousness to us. He is with us, and we find his favor. He is with us in the sense that he is our shepherd, leading us, protecting, providing. In this statement of being with us, it gives us, the people of God, that comfort of his divine presence and his divine assistance. It is very parallel to the Shekinah glory of God in the tabernacle, who went around with the people of God, directing them, protecting them, guiding them while they're in the wilderness. And it says, "I'm with you always." The word for always is all of the days. Implication, all of the days of your life. Until the age is complete, until the time is perfect, until there's an end, which is his return. Until I return again, I'm not leaving you. I am with you in your presence, and I am for you because I'm gracious to you. So since he has all authority, and he's always with us and gracious to us, that clearly teaches and shows that we're eternally secure. Who is greater than God? Okay, so from the words of the Mount, Matthew has shown us 4 significances of the resurrection. Number 1, that the risen Christ is to be worshipped, being God. And we now, on this side of the resurrection, as his people, we worship him as our God. The man, Jesus, who is God and completely man. Number 2, the risen Christ has been given authority over all creation. The victory is already won. And that all authority includes life and includes authority over death, which he is now exercising because the risen Christ is creating disciples who are united with God. He has that authority to save. And it's a people who are obediently following him. So it's not just a God has the authority to save, but an authority to create people who can be obedient to him, who can walk pleasing to him. That is a walk of righteousness. He was raised for our justification, as Romans talks about. And then fourthly, the significance is that the risen Christ is gracious with us always. That's a great comfort, that he's always with us and always for us. That is Matthew's account of the resurrection of Jesus.